Nico Veras always thought diplomacy was like juggling knives. It wasn't exciting or glamorous, but if you screwed up, at least everything ended in a bloody mess. Today, though, felt less like juggling and more like standing blindfolded in front of a firing squad. The reception hall on the front line of the xenophobic empire was designed with all the warmth of a morgue. Everything was steel and chrome, the kind of aesthetic you'd find if androids developed a fetish for interrogation. Sure, the Empire claimed they were all about peace, but their decor suggested they were more interested in seeing how many humans could fit on a spit. Nico adjusted his collar. The fabric rubbed against his neck like sandpaper, a reminder that comfort was for people who weren't trying to prevent a galactic war. He reminded himself he was here to negotiate peace, not to critique interior design. The door slid open with a sound reminiscent of a guillotine being sharpened. In walked Ilara Nix, his trusted strategist, wearing her usual expression of someone who had just bitten into a lemon and found it lacking in acidity. "Nico, nice to see you're dressed like a man going to his own funeral," Ilara said, her voice dripping sarcasm like it was the only flavor available. "Hey, someone's got to make the Empire think humans have a dignified dress code," Nico replied, glancing down at his meticulously pressed suit. It was the only thing in his life that wasn't wrinkled with cynicism. Ilara dropped a stack of data pads on the table. Each one represented an area where the humans were supposed to bend over backward to make peace with the Empire. "Look at this," she said, swiping through holographic pages of demands. "They want us to apologize for literally existing. I didn't even know that was a thing. Apologies for existing are the top export of the human race," Nico quipped, tapping the table in a rhythm that defied the anxiety gnawing at his nerves. If only they'd accept sarcasm as currency, we could retire by now. A rustle at the door announced the arrival of their security officer, Jax Holton, a man whose biceps seemed to have their own gravitational pull. He walked in with the swagger of someone who knew every room was just a backdrop for his own ego. "Holton, what's the word?" Nico asked, grateful for a momentary distraction from the crushing weight of impending doom. Jax grinned, a flash of teeth more dangerous than comforting. "Well, if the Empire decides to send assassins, they'll have to get through me first. Let's just say, I'll make sure they regret being born if they even do that," Nico smirked. "I'm sure your mother's proud." Ilara rolled her eyes, a gesture she'd perfected to art form status. "Can we focus? We're about to walk into a meeting with people who'd rather see us space than shaken hands with." Nico nodded, the humor momentarily draining from his face like blood from a punctured artery. "Yeah, let's get to it. The Empire's head diplomat will meet us soon, and I'd hate to make them wait. After all, punctuality is next to godliness, or is that cleanliness? I always get those mixed up." They made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the station, the Empire's soldiers watching them with expressions that suggested they were deciding between shooting their guests or just glaring them into submission. "It's nice, isn't it?" Ilara whispered, nodding towards a pair of guards whose faces could curdle milk. "Being so welcomed," Nico chuckled, "like walking into a surprise party where everyone forgot to yell surprise and just went straight to the glaring." They reached the conference room, a cavernous space with a table large enough to double as a landing strip. The Empire's representative, a man with a face that looked permanently sculpted into a sneer, sat at the far end. "Ah, the humans," the representative said, his voice as oily as the black market. "I was wondering when you'd show up. Did you get lost, or is navigation as foreign to your kind as diplomacy?" Nico forced a smile, the kind that hurt his cheeks. "We were just admiring the excellent hospitality." "Really makes a man feel welcome. The Empire believes in efficiency, not frivolous niceties," the representative replied, gesturing towards the empty chairs. "Shall we begin?" Nico and his team took their seats, the tension thick enough to choke on. The Empire's demands were laid out in no uncertain terms. Humans would have to sacrifice, concede, apologize, and probably perform a tap dance just to keep things civil. "What do you think, Ilara?" Nico asked, tapping his temple in thought. "I mean, they're basically asking us to surrender with a bow and a thank you card." Ilara leaned forward, her eyes hard as starship hulls. "I think they need to remember we're here to negotiate, not roll over and expose our bellies." The representative raised an eyebrow. "You humans always were a proud species." "It's almost adorable," Nico sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Adorable like a rabid dog, maybe." Ior's passed intense discussion, each side dancing around the real issues like two cats in a bag. At one point, Jax leaned over to Nico, whispering, "You know, at this rate, I'm going to need a new hobby. How about knitting? I hear it's less stressful than galactic diplomacy." Nico chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, maybe we can make sweaters for everyone. I survived peace talks with the Empire and all I got was this lousy cardigan." Finally, the meeting ended with no more resolution than a soap opera cliffhanger. As the humans stood to leave, the Empire's representative gave them a smile that promised nothing but trouble. "I do hope your stay with us continues to be enlightening," he said, his tone suggesting enlightenment was code for "get ready to be screwed over." Nico returned the smile with one of his own, all teeth and no sincerity. "We aim to please." Back in their quarters, Nico slumped into a chair, every muscle in his body screaming for relief. "Well, that was fun," he said to Ilara and Jax, "like pulling teeth." "Except we're the teeth." Ilara shook her head, folding her arms. "They're playing hardball, but we can't let them think we're easy targets. We've got to find leverage, something that makes them sit up and take notice." Jax cracked his knuckles. "I'm not one for politics, but I do know one thing. Everyone's got a skeleton or two in their closet. We just need to find theirs." Nico nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "All right, let's dig up some dirt. The Empire wants a fight. We'll give them a reason to back down first." As they plodded, a sense of determination settled over them like a storm cloud. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, but if they fell, they'd damn well make sure they took a few Empire lackeys with them. The next morning, as they prepared to venture deeper into the Empire's territory, Ilara paused at the door, her gaze locking onto Nico's. "You ready for this?" Nico grinned, a wicked gleam in his eyes. "Born ready. Besides, if it all goes to hell, at least we'll have one hell of a punchline." The team stepped out, ready to face whatever the Empire had in store. They might have been the galaxy's unwanted guests, but they damn sure wouldn't go quietly into the night. And with that, the Diplomat's last stand truly began. They were about to unmask a conspiracy, one punchline at a time. The conference room was colder than a tax collector's heart, and the air felt like it was auditioning for a role in a morgue commercial. Nico Veras stood at the head of the table, staring at the Empire's representative with the kind of look that suggested he was calculating how many different ways he could stab him with his pen and still call it diplomacy. It was a talent, really, turning everyday objects into potential murder weapons, but Nico figured it'd take more than a biro to solve this mess. "All right, let's do this," Nico said, his voice as cheerful as a funeral dirge. "We all know why we're here, because nobody really wants to be." The Empire's representative, a man whose face resembled a cheese grater that had seen better days, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his lips like a bad joke that refused to end. "Indeed, although one wonders if you humans truly comprehend the art of negotiation. You see, we're more accustomed to discussions where the opposing party doesn't bring their own noose." Ilara Nix, ever the ray of sarcastic sunlight, piped up with a grin that could cut glass. "Oh, we brought a noose all right. It's just that yours is made of paperwork." Before the representative could retort with a line as sharp as a butter knife, the door to the conference room slid open with a hiss, revealing Jax Holton, whose muscles had their own gravitational field and who walked like he was the star of every action movie ever made. "Sorry, am I interrupting a riveting exchange of bullshit?" Jax said, sauntering in with the grace of a bulldozer. It's just that I could hear the sound of egos clashing all the way down the corridor. Nico held up a hand, a gesture more for himself than for anyone else. All right, let's get back to business. We've got concessions to discuss, and by discuss, I mean find a way to make them less painful than a root canal. The air thickened with tension, every word exchanged like a punch in a bar brawl where no one was interested in holding back. But as the debate ground on, it became apparent that neither side would budge, like two asteroids with a vendetta against each other, destined to collide. And then, just as Nico began to think they'd reached the peak of their stalemate, the room exploded with movement. A sleek drone, barely the size of a fist but carrying the malevolent intent of a serial killer, zipped into the room. It hovered for a heartbeat, long enough for Nico's eyes to widen in realization. "Down," he barked, lunging towards Ilara with all the grace of a man destined to die with a witty comment on his lips. But it was too late. A beam of energy, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, sliced through the air, and Nico felt the world tilt on its axis. The last thing he saw was the look of horror on Ilara's face, her jaw clenched tight as if to keep the universe from unraveling. Then darkness, as swift and final as a guillotine's kiss. Ilara stood frozen, watching as Nico's lifeless body hit the deck with a dull thud that echoed in her ears like the final bell of a doomed prizefighter. Her mind raced, a frantic mess of disbelief and anger, each emotion clawing for dominance. The Empire's representative stood abruptly, his expression a mask of feigned shock that Ilara wanted to rip off and use to strangle him. "What is the meaning of this treachery?" he demanded, his voice the very picture of indignant outrage. Jax had his weapon drawn and aimed in the blink of an eye, his eyes narrow slits of fury. "Don't play the innocent card, asshole. We all saw where that drone came from your side of the room," the representative shot back, the smirk reappearing on his lips like a cockroach that refused to die. "A convenient excuse to disrupt these talks, wouldn't you say?" Ilara felt the weight of the universe pressing down on her, but she shoved it aside with the force of a woman who had no time for cosmic games. Stepping forward, she pointed a finger at the representative, her voice cold enough to freeze hell over. "You think we're stupid enough to assassinate our own diplomat in a room full of witnesses? This smells like a setup, and I don't intend to let you get away with it." The room descended into chaos, accusations flying like shrapnel, each word designed to wound. The Empire's soldiers surged forward, weapons drawn, their intent clear as day. Meanwhile, the humans stood their ground, every muscle coiled and ready to spring, like a pack of wolves prepared to fight to the last breath. Ilara's mind raced, calculating a dozen scenarios, each more disastrous than the last. With Nico gone, the mission was hers, and though the weight of it threatened to crush her, she knew she wouldn't buckle. "Not here, not now. We need to get out," Jax murmured, his voice a low rumble that never failed to calm her nerves, even with a dozen guns pointed their way. "This place is a powder keg and someone's already lit the fuse." "Agreed," Ilara replied, her voice clipped and efficient, the way it always was when she was fighting to keep panic at bay. "But we can't just leave Nico." Jax nodded, his gaze flicking to where Nico lay, a stark reminder of their failure to protect him. "We won't, but we'll make sure he didn't die for nothing." Somehow, Ilara found herself nodding, the words a lifeline she clung to with all her strength. She glanced at the Empire's representative, who watched them with the smug satisfaction of a man convinced he'd already won. "You're making a mistake," Ilara called out, her voice carrying the ominous weight of a storm. "Whatever game you're playing, it'll blow up in your face. Count on it." With a shared look that spoke volumes, Ilara and Jax turned and retreated, their exit as calculated as a chess move made with the knowledge of someone's breathing down your neck. Behind them, the room descended into a cacophony of raised voices, but all Ilara could hear was the thudding of her heart, each beat a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting. Back in the relative safety of their quarters, Ilara paced, her mind a whirlwind of half-formed plans and unrelenting anger. Jack stood silently by the door, his presence a comforting solidity in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. "What do we do now?" Jax asked, his voice like gravel scraping over a wound. "We've lost Nico and the talks are dead in the water." Ilara stopped, her mind latching onto a single, unyielding truth. "We find out who really killed him. If this was a setup, there's something bigger at play, and I intend to unravel it." Jax nodded, a grim smile stretching across his face. "Just tell me where to start digging." Ilara's mind began to spin, each thread of thought a potential lead, a way to get to the truth buried beneath layers of deceit. "We need access to the security feeds. If we can prove that drone wasn't ours, we might have a shot at turning this around." Jax's grin widened, an expression that could have been mistaken for joy if it weren't for the situation. "Well, that sounds like a party. I'll get my hacking gear." As they prepared to set their plan in motion, Ilara felt the weight of Nico's absence, a shadow that refused to lift. But she also felt a fierce determination, a fire that burned brighter with each passing second. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice a steely promise to herself and to Nico, wherever he might be. "We've got a galaxy to save, and I refuse to let some smarmy imperial bastard take it from us." With that, they set out to uncover the conspiracy that had cost them a friend and threatened to plunge the entire galaxy into chaos. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but Ilara knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't go down without a fight. And if she had her way, they'd make the Empire rue the day they decided to mess with humanity. Ilara paced the confines of their quarters like a caged animal, though she'd never seen an animal that could swing sarcasm like a bludgeon. Her mind was a flurry of plans, each more reckless than the last, but recklessness was practically a requirement for survival out here, right alongside breathing. Jax leaned against the door, arms crossed, watching her with the same expression a cat might use when considering a particularly stupid mouse. "You do realize pacing won't bring Nico back, right?" His voice was dry enough to start a brush fire. She threw him a look that would have melted steel. "Yeah." "Well, standing there looking like the world's most disgruntled gym instructor won't help either." He snorted, a sound that was both amusement and derision, the two getting along about as well as oil and water. "All right, so what's the plan, genius? We gonna storm the gates or what?" Ilara paused mid-step, the shadows under her eyes a testament to the question that plagued her. "First, we need those security feeds. If we can prove that drone wasn't ours, we might have a shot at outing whoever set us up." Jax pushed himself off the wall, his grin widening like a kid who'd just been told he could have dessert before dinner. "Now you're talking. Let's go steal us some Imperial secrets." They slipped out of their quarters, the corridors of the human enclave as silent as the aftermath of a bad joke. Every step they took was a calculated risk, the chance of running into Imperial soldiers a constant tick at the back of their minds, like a time bomb that refused to shut up. The control room was 3 floors up, a small mercy in a building designed with more twists and turns than a politician's promises. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the deserted halls like the whispers of a ghost. "Remind me again why we agreed to this," Jax muttered as they climbed yet another flight of stairs. "Because we're the only ones stubborn enough to think we can win," Ilara replied, her tone as dry as the rations they'd been surviving on. "And because if we don't, Nico died for nothing." "Good enough for me," Jax said, though his expression suggested he would have preferred a plan involving less running and more explosions. The door to the control room was locked, but locks were more of a suggestion than a hindrance when it came to Jax. He pulled a small device from his pocket, its surface bristling with wires and circuits that glowed an ominous red. "This'll only take a sec," he said, attaching the device to the door's control panel with the ease of someone plugging in a toaster. A moment later, the door slid open with a reluctant hiss. Inside, the room hummed with the low, consistent thrum of machinery, the air filled with the sharp tang of ozone. Monitors lined the walls, each displaying a different part of the enclave or flickering with static like they were auditioning for a horror film. Ilara moved to the nearest console, her fingers dancing over the keys with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of chaos. "All right, let's see what the Empire's been trying to hide." Jax kept watch by the door, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of trouble. "You sure you know what you're doing with that thing? Last time I checked, you weren't exactly the tech whiz." "Yeah, well, desperation's a great teacher," Ilara replied, her focus unwavering. "Besides, I'm not the one who fried his own data pad trying to download space porn." "Hey, that was research," Jax shot back, though the amused glint in his eye suggested he wasn't too offended. "For all we know, the Empire's got a killer sense of humor." Ilara snorted, the sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff. "Right. And I'm the queen of the universe." The console beeped, the display shifting to show the security feeds they'd been hoping to find. Ilara scanned the footage, her eyes narrowed as she searched for the moment that had changed everything. "There," she said, pausing the video at the exact second the drone entered the room. "That's our guy." Jax leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. "Looks like it's coming from the Empire side, just like we thought." Ilara nodded, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the puzzle. "Which means they've got someone on the inside. Someone who wants to see these talks crash and burn." "Great," Jax said, his voice a mix of frustration and grim determination. "Just what we needed, more backstabbers in a room full of them." "But now we've got proof," Ilara replied, her tone fierce enough to cut through the tension like a knife. "And we're going to use it to blow this whole thing wide open." Before they could celebrate their small victory, a new sound interrupted them, the unmistakable clatter of boots on metal, approaching fast. Jax glanced at Ilara, his expression shifting from bemusement to readiness in the span of a heartbeat. "Looks like we're about to have company," he said, reaching for his weapon with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he'd been born with it in his hand. "Then let's give them a warm welcome," Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "They want a fight. We'll give them one they'll never forget." The corridor was filled with the sound of approaching soldiers, their footsteps a relentless drumbeat that echoed through the enclave like the March of Doom. Ilara and Jax moved to the door, their weapons at the ready, the tension between them a living thing that crackled in the air. The first soldier rounded the corner, his armor gleaming like a bad decision waiting to happen. Jax fired, the shot echoing through the corridor with the finality of a slammed door. The soldier went down, his body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. Ilara fired next, her aim as precise as a sniper with a vendetta. Another soldier fell, his weapon clattering to the floor with a sound that was almost musical in its finality. "This is starting to feel like a bar brawl," Jax muttered, reloading his weapon with a speed that spoke of far too much practice. "Just with less alcohol and more blood," Ilara replied, her focus unwavering as she took aim once more. "And at least in a bar brawl, you know who's on your side." The fight was brief and brutal, the corridor transformed into a battlefield where mercy was a foreign concept. When the last soldier fell, the silence that followed was as deafening as the gunfire had been. Jax surveyed the scene, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Well, that was fun. We should really do this more often." Ilara gave a short, humorless laugh, the sound more bitter than sweet. "Yeah, I'll pencil it in between avoid getting killed and unravel conspiracy." With the immediate threat dealt with, they returned to the control room, their victory tinged with the knowledge that it was only temporary. The Empire would regroup, and when they did, they'd be back with a vengeance. Ilara turned back to the console, her thoughts a chaotic mix of possible plans and potential pitfalls. "We need to get this footage out there. If we can leak it, we might have a chance at turning the tide." "And how exactly do we do that without getting ourselves killed in the process?" Jax asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Ilara hesitated, the reality of their situation a weight that pressed down on her shoulders like a leaden cloak. We find someone we can trust. Someone outside the Enclave who can distribute it without getting caught. Jax raised an eyebrow, his skepticism undiminished. You really think there's anyone out there we can trust? Not really, Ilara admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. But it's either that or wait for the Empire to pick us off one by one. Jax nodded, his expression thoughtful. All right then, let's find ourselves a trustworthy rogue. Should be easy enough, right? Ilara managed a wan smile, the expression more forced than genuine. Sure, just like finding a needle in a haystack full of grenades. They set to work, their minds focused on the task at hand, the pressing urgency of their mission overriding everything else. The clock was ticking, and the longer they took, the closer they came to the point of no return. As they sifted through the data, searching for the key that would open the door to their salvation, Ilara felt the weight of Nico's absence like a physical ache. But she also felt something else, a fierce determination, a fire that burned brightly even in the darkest moments. They would expose the conspiracy, no matter the cost. And when they did, the Empire would learn a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Never underestimate the tenacity of a human with nothing left to lose. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but Ilara knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop until they'd uncovered the truth. And if the Empire thought they could silence her and Jax, they'd soon discover just how wrong they were. The control room felt more like a sardine can with delusions of grandeur than a hub of high-tech espionage. Yet here they were, tucked away amidst outdated machinery and dusty screens. Ilara and Jax were knee-deep in a world of trouble, and it was only getting worse. Looks like the Empire's really rolled out the red carpet for us, Jax said, peering out from behind the grimy control room window. A welcoming committee with guns. How thoughtful. Ilara snorted, her eyes fixed on the flickering screens. Yeah, it's like they're just begging us to gatecrash their little tea party. We must be the life of the party. The terminal in front of her was an ancient beast of circuitry, likely assembled when the concept of user-friendly was still just a twinkle in some engineer's eye. But she'd coaxed access to the security feed, so she wasn't about to complain. Check this out, Ilara said, gesturing to one of the screens. It displayed a series of halls, soldiers scurrying like ants around a particularly juicy crumb. Looks like they've upped their game. Maybe someone told them we weren't playing nice. You think? Jax shook his head. I'd have thought the gunshots were a subtle hint. Outside, the corridors were a tapestry of chaos. Soldiers bustled, rifles clutched like security blankets. It was clear the Empire wasn't taking any chances after the last run-in. They were doubling down on their paranoia with more firepower than a Friday night at a fireworks factory. All right, if we're going to make a move, it has to be now, Ilara said, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. She was in full command mode, eyes narrowed like a hawk eyeing its prey. We need to get that footage out before they lock us down tighter than a miser's wallet. Jax nodded, his expression shifting to something resembling grim determination. So, what's the plan, boss? We make a run for it, or do we try talking them to death with your sparkling wit? Hey, sarcasm's got us this far, Ilara shot back, a smirk tugging at her lips. But no, I was thinking more along the lines of distract and dash. You up for playing the hero? Jax gave a mock salute. Always ready to be the expendable one. Just point me where you need a loud bang. Ilara's fingers flew over the keys, setting up a loop in the security feed, a digital smokescreen to cover their tracks. I'll give them something to look at while you make your run. Get to the server room, patch this footage into their comms. Server room, huh? Jax cocked an eyebrow. Isn't that a bit like running naked through a minefield? More like a minefield with a few blindfolded bomb diffusers thrown in for fun, Ilara replied with a shrug. But we've got to take the risk. We've got the proof. Now we need to spread it like a virus. Jax exhaled, glancing down the corridor where the soldiers were grouping like vultures around a carcass. All right. I'll give them a chase to remember. Ilara watched as Jack slipped from the control room, his footsteps barely a whisper on the cold metal floor. He moved with a grace that belied his bulk, a testament to countless scrapes and near misses. Meanwhile, she focused on her task, guiding the security system into a digital dance that would, with luck, bamboozle their enemies just long enough. The seconds stretched into minutes, every tick of the clock a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Ilara's mind was a whirlwind of calculations, each decision a gamble with stakes higher than the dice in a rigged casino. Suddenly, the clatter of gunfire reverberated through the corridor, a symphony of chaos that signaled Jax had made his move. Ilara's heart pounded in time with the shots, each one a reminder of how close they were to being caught. "Come on, Jax," she muttered under her breath, eyeing the screens for any sign that he'd made it through. "Move your giant ass." In the distant corner of one screen, Ilara spotted Jax sprinting, his figure a blur as he tore through the corridors. Soldiers pursued, their ranks thinning as they split to chase him down, their shouts echoing with feudal authority. If nothing else, Jax was proving he could lead a chase that would make a rabbit proud. Back in the control room, Ilara returned to her own task, fingers blurring across the keyboard. The Empire's network was a labyrinth of firewalls and encryption, but desperation was a fine whetstone for skill. With a final keystroke, she initiated the upload, sending the incriminating footage spiraling through the Empire's communications channels. As the upload completed, Ilara allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. They'd done it. Now it was just a matter of surviving the fallout. "Jax," she spoke into the comlink, her voice low but firm. "It's done. Time to get the hell out of there." "Easy for you to say," came Jax's breathless reply, punctuated by the occasional sound of gunfire. "I've got half the Empire's foot soldiers on my tail and they're not exactly asking for autographs." Ilara grimaced. "Just keep running. I'll meet you at the rendezvous point." With that, she slipped out of the control room, her movements quick and silent. The corridors were still a maze of soldiers, but the chaos provided cover. Every step was a calculated risk, the tension a tangible thing that clung to her like a second skin. The rendezvous point was a small maintenance hatch, half hidden behind a stack of crates that had seen better days. It was their escape route, the tunnel that would lead them away from the prying eyes and trigger-happy fingers of the Empire's finest. Ilara crouched beside the hatch, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She listened, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as Jax led the soldiers further from their position. There was no sign of him yet, but she trusted he'd make it. Jax was nothing if not persistent. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, a rhythm that matched Ilara's own heartbeat. She tensed, weapon at the ready, but relaxed slightly when Jax rounded the corner, panting but unscathed. "Cutting it a bit close, don't you think?" she said, her tone teasing despite the relief that flooded through her. Jax flashed a grin, dropping down beside her. "Hey, I like to keep things interesting. Besides, who else was gonna give you a heart attack?" "Good point," Ilara conceded, opening the hatch and gesturing for him to enter. "Let's get out of here before our luck runs out." They slipped into the tunnel, the darkness a welcome reprieve from the chaos above. It was a tight fit, the walls pressing in on all sides like the embrace of a long-lost relative who didn't understand personal space. But it was safe, and right now that was all that mattered. The trek through the tunnel was a silent one, their mind on what lay ahead. They had the footage, the proof they needed to expose the Empire's treachery, but getting it into the right hands was another matter entirely. "What's the plan once we're topside?" Jax asked, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "We find someone who can get this to the right people," Ilara replied. "Someone outside the Enclave who can distribute it without drawing attention. And where do we find this miracle worker?" Jax sounded skeptical, and Ilara couldn't blame him. "We'll figure it out," she said, though her confidence was more bravado than certainty. "We've come this far. We can handle this." Jax was silent for a moment, then he spoke again, his tone lighter. And if all else fails, I hear space has some lovely retirement options. Ilara laughed, the sound a welcome release of tension. Yeah, I'm sure we could find a nice little asteroid to settle down on. Maybe start a farm, grow space potatoes. Sounds idyllic, Jax said, his own laughter mingling with hers. But let's save that for Plan B. The tunnel eventually spat them out into the open, the cool air a welcome relief after the claustrophobic passage. They emerged in a quiet sector of the enclave, far from the chaos they'd left behind. Ilara took a deep breath, savoring the moment of peace. But she knew it wouldn't last. The Empire was relentless, and their enemies would regroup. They had to move quickly to stay one step ahead in a game where the stakes were life and death. "All right," she said, turning to Jax with a determined glint in her eye. "Let's find ourselves a miracle worker." Jax nodded, his expression reflecting her resolve. "Lead the way, boss." Together they set off into the unknown, their path a twisting, treacherous road that offered no guarantees. But they were determined, and in this grim, unforgiving universe, sometimes determination was all you had. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep them moving forward, step by step, through the darkness. Ilara's head felt like a drum, and the echoes of gunfire from earlier didn't help. The Enclave was holding on by the skin of its teeth. If you could call what was happening holding on. The corridors were filled with the sounds of despair, shouting, groaning, and the not-so-occasional explosion. "Do you ever think we're on the wrong side of this fight?" Jax asked, leaning against a wall that seemed about as stable as a stack of gelatins. His breath came in ragged gasps. The chase had taken its toll. "Well, we could always join the Empire," Ilara replied, sarcasm dripping from her words. "I'm sure they have a lovely onboarding process. Probably a seminar on how to throw the best torture parties." Jax chuckled, though it sounded more like a cough. "Yeah, I'm not really a fan of their recruitment videos. Too much screaming and not enough catchy theme songs. The Empire's forces were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out like beer at a college party. They needed a plan, and fast. But right now, all they had was a wish and a prayer, minus the prayer. Nico Varys entered the room, looking like the universe had personally pissed in his cereal. He was the one tasked with keeping morale high, but at the moment he looked ready to throw that task out the nearest airlock. "Bad news, folks," Nico said, shuffling data pads like a gambler with a losing hand. "The Empire's sending reinforcements." "Double time, of course they are," Ilara muttered. "I mean, why not? It's not like we have anything else to worry about." Jax tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Maybe they're just coming for sightseeing. I hear our misery is quite the tourist attraction, or they're here for the food," Ilara quipped dryly. "I hear desperation pairs well with despair." Nico ignored their banter, focusing instead on the task at hand. "We need options, fast options." "We've got two," Jax said, holding up a couple of fingers for emphasis. "Fight or flight. The only question is which one will get us killed slower." Before anyone could respond, there was a clatter from the other side of the room. The door swung open to reveal a figure that none of them expected. The Empire's representative, the man with a face like a well-loved cheese grater. "Nice place you've got here," he said with a smirk, as if he'd just strolled into a dinner party instead of a war zone. "Though I must say your hospitality leaves something to be desired." Ilara's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "Other than to gloat, obviously. Oddly enough, I'm here to help you," the man said, his smirk widening into something that might have passed for a smile if viewed through a funhouse mirror. "I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse." Jax crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Oh yeah? What's that?" "A swift death," the representative chuckled. "Tempting, but no, I have information. A way out of this mess that won't end with your untimely demise." Nico raised an eyebrow. "And what's the catch?" "There's always a catch," the man shrugged. "Let's just say my loyalties aren't as rigid as my colleagues. I'm not particularly fond of the Empire, and I'm willing to help you if it means sticking it to them." Ilara's mind raced. Could they trust him? Probably not. But at this point, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. "All right, we'll bite." "What's your plan? There's a back door out of the Enclave," he said. "An old maintenance tunnel that leads to an unmonitored sector. I can get you there." "Convenient," Nico said, skepticism etched in every word. "And why should we believe you?" "Because," the representative replied, "if I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already." That, Ilara had to admit, was a fair point. Reluctantly, they followed the Empire's representative through the winding corridors. The Enclave felt like it was on life support, barely clinging to existence, and every explosion shuddering through its bones felt like a countdown to the end. As they moved, the representative filled them in on the details. Security protocols they'd bypass, guards they'd have to avoid, and most importantly, how to disappear right under the Empire's noses. "So, what's your angle?" Jax asked as they ducked into a shadowy alcove to avoid a patrol. "You're not exactly doing this out of the goodness of your heart." "I have my reasons," the representative replied cryptically. "Let's just say I'm not a fan of the Empire's endgame." They continued on, the tension winding tighter with every step. When they finally reached the entrance to the maintenance tunnel, it felt like the first breath after being underwater for too long. "This is it," the representative said, gesturing to the hatch. "Follow this and you'll be in the clear." Ilara hesitated, doubt gnawing at her. "And you're okay with this?" "Betraying your empire. I was never really one of them," he replied, the smirk gone now, replaced by a grim determination. "And besides, I've got my own escape route. This place is going to hell and I'd rather not be here for the fireworks." Ilara nodded, understanding that more than she liked. "Thanks," she said, though gratitude felt foreign on her tongue. "Just remember," he said, leaning back against the wall with that familiar grin, "you owe me one." With that, they disappeared into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. It was a tight fit, like everything in this place, and the air felt stale, untouched for years. But it was a way out, a fragile glimmer of hope in a universe that seemed hell-bent on snuffing them out. "Do you think we can trust him?" Jax asked, his voice echoing softly in the confined space. "Trust?" Ilara replied with a bitter laugh. "No, but what other choice do we have? It's either this or stick around and watch the fireworks from the inside." "Good point," Jax conceded. "And who can resist a good tunnel crawl?" The journey was slow, the cramped confines forcing them to move carefully. But every step took them further from the chaos above and closer to the unknown beyond. It was a gamble, but then everything about their lives was a gamble these days. "Once we're out of here," Nico said, breaking the silence, "we need to find a way to get the footage into the right hands." Ilara nodded, though the path ahead was far from clear. They still had a long way to go, and the Empire wasn't going to make it easy. But they were alive for now, and that counted for something. At the end of the tunnel, they found themselves emerging into a rarely used hangar, its vastness echoing in the stillness. It was a place forgotten by time and empire alike, a relic from a different era. "Well, this is cozy," Jax said, glancing around at the derelict ships and abandoned equipment. "Makes you wonder why they didn't turn it into another torture chamber." "Probably too drafty," Ilara replied. "Bad for the screams." As they made their way through the hangar, a plan began to form in Ilara's mind. The footage was their ace, but they needed to play it right. One wrong move and everything would come crashing down. But for now, they had a chance, slim but there. And in their world, that was the best you could hope for. "We need to move fast," Nico said, urgency in his voice. "The Empire won't let this slide." "Right," Ilara agreed. "Let's find a ship that still works and get the hell out of here." The search was quick, the hangar yielding a rundown transport that seemed more rust than metal. But it powered up, and in moments they were off, slipping through the Empire's fingers like sand through a sieve. As they flew, the stars stretching out before them, Jax leaned back in his seat, a grin spreading across his face. Not bad for a bunch of rebels with more luck than sense. Ilara smiled, though it was a weary one. They'd made it this far, but there was still a long way to go, and the universe wasn't done with them yet. But for now, they had a glimmer of hope, and that was enough to keep them going. Enough to keep them fighting in a universe that seemed hell-bent on proving just how small and insignificant they really were. And so, with the galaxy spread out before them, they flew towards the future, uncertain but determined, ready to take on whatever came next. The transport rattled like a tin can in a tumble dryer as it tore through the void. Jack sat at the helm, wrestling with the controls like a wrestler with a grudge. "I swear, this thing's held together by duct tape and desperation," he muttered, his voice a low growl of frustration. Ilara, strapped into the co-pilot seat, grinned despite herself. "Hey, as long as it doesn't fall apart mid-flight, we're golden, or at least gold-plated." "Maybe bronze." Nico, wedged into the cramped back seat, looked like someone had just told him Christmas was canceled. "Please tell me there's a plan that doesn't involve us getting blown to smithereens." "Define plan," Ilara said, her voice dry as a desert planet. "I mean, if you're looking for a detailed itinerary, you're fresh out of luck. But if you want a half-baked scheme with more holes than an asteroid belt, I'm your girl." "Half-baked's optimistic," Jax chimed in, his eyes scanning the flickering control panel. "I'd say we're still mixing the batter." Ilara leaned back, her mind racing. Their newfound ally had given them more than just a way out. He'd handed them a smoking gun, a payload of damning intel that could blow the Empire's peace propaganda to smithereens. The trick was getting it into the right hands without getting themselves fragged in the process. "All right, here's the pitch," Ilara said, her voice full of gritty determination. "We've got footage of the Empire doing what they do best, being colossal jerks. Now we just need to upload this little gem to every news outlet, public feed, and social media channel from here to the star cluster. Easier said than done, of course." The Empire had a stranglehold on communication networks tighter than a miser's grip on his wallet. But there had to be a way, a loophole they could exploit. They just needed to be smart, or reckless. Recklessly smart. "So where do we start?" Nico asked, his voice laced with a mix of skepticism and hope. A dubious cocktail, but one they all had to sip from daily. "The Enclave's got a broadcast system, right?" Jax said, his voice thoughtful, though it was clear thinking wasn't his favorite pastime. "Sure, it's probably older than dirt, but it's a start." "Yeah," Ilara nodded, "and old tech means less Empire oversight. If we can tap into that, we might just pull this off. But we'll need to be quick. Once the Empire gets wind of this, they'll be on us like a bad rash." "And here I was hoping for a quiet weekend," Nico sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. But hey, nothing like an impending doom to keep things lively. The flight continued with the tension in the cabin so thick you'd need a plasma torch to cut through it. Each of them was acutely aware that one wrong move would spell their end, but as usual, that was just a Tuesday around these parts. The Enclave loomed ahead, a sprawling mass of tarnished metal and flickering lights, like a beacon for the damned. Jax brought the transport in for a landing, every jolt and shudder a reminder that they were flying by the skin of their teeth. Ilara jumped out first, her boots hitting the deck with a thud. The place was as lively as a graveyard in the dead of night. "Let's get to the control room," she said, leading the way through the maze of corridors, each twist and turn a potential ambush. Nico and Jax followed, the former glancing nervously over his shoulder, expecting the Empire to spring out from every shadow. The place was falling apart, but the smell of desperation and stale air was comfortingly familiar. "Feels like coming home," Jax quipped as they ducked under a low-hanging conduit, one that looked ready to drop at any moment. "You know, if your home was a center for existential dread." "Yeah, well, at least here we know who wants to kill us," Ilara shot back. "Makes the guessing game a bit easier." They reached the control room, a dimly lit, claustrophobic space filled with enough outdated tech to make a museum curator cry tears of joy. Ilara took her place at the ancient terminal, its keys yellowed with age, and started tapping away, each click echoing in the oppressive silence. "All right, let's see what we've got," she muttered, fingers flying across the keyboard. "And let's hope this thing doesn't blow up in our faces." The system wheezed into life, screens flickering like the ghosts of a bygone era. It took some coaxing, but finally the broadcast interface popped up. Ilara felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that came with a heady mix of fear and excitement. "This is it," Nico said, peering over her shoulder with the kind of intensity usually reserved for high-stakes card games. "We're really doing this." "Damn right we are," Jax added, a wicked grin splitting his face. "Time to show those Empire bastards they're not the only ones who can play dirty." Ilara started the upload, the footage streaming into the system like a river of rebellion. It was a shaky hand, but one they had to play even if the stakes were sky high. As the footage began to disseminate across the network, Ilara couldn't help but feel a pang of pride. Here they were, a ragtag band of outcasts, sticking it to the Empire in the only way they knew how. It was reckless, sure, but in a universe that seemed to revel in kicking them when they were down, it felt damn good to punch back. "Now we wait," she said, leaning back in the creaky chair, "and see if the universe decides to give us a break for once, or just laugh in our faces," Jax added, his tone dry as a desert. "Wouldn't be the first time." Nico settled into a corner, eyes scanning the room as if expecting the Empire to burst through the walls. "Let's just hope we get to enjoy the show before they come crashing down on us." The minutes ticked by, each one dragging on with agonizing slowness. Ilara checked the upload status, willing it to move faster as if sheer willpower could bend the laws of technology. And then a crackle of static burst from the speakers, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, but the message clear. Their footage was live. Across the network, screens flickered to life, showing the Empire's dirty laundry for all to see. "This better work," Nico said, his voice low, almost a prayer to any cosmic force that might be listening. "Otherwise, we're screwed 6 ways from Sunday." "Well, look at it this way," Jax said with a smirk. "At least we'll go out in a blaze of glory." Or, a footnote in some Empire officer's report. Ilara's grin was a mix of triumph and trepidation. Either way, it's a hell of a lot better than just rolling over. But as the screens glowed with their triumph, a voice crackled over the intercom, dripping with that familiar Empire smugness. "Attention, insurgents," it began, the sound of an incoming storm. "We know what you're doing, and it won't end well for you." "Well, that was fast," Nico muttered, casting a wary glance at the ceiling, as if expecting it to cave in any second. "Guess they're not big on subtlety," Ilara replied, her fingers hovering over the keys. "But hey, at least we got their attention." "Yeah. Now we just have to figure out how to survive it," Jax added, the humor in his voice masking the tension that pulsed through them all. The Empire would come, of that they were sure. But for now, they'd thrown a wrench into the works, shown the galaxy the truth, and reminded themselves that even in the darkest of times, there was still fight left in them. "Whatever happens next," Ilara said, her voice echoing in the silence, "we did something today. We made a stand." Nico nodded, a look of grim determination settling over his features. "And we'll keep standing as long as it takes." "Damn right," Jax agreed, his expression a mix of defiance and mischief. "After all, if we're going to go down, we might as well take a few of them with us." Ilara smiled, the kind of smile that came from knowing you'd given it your all, even if the outcome was uncertain. And as they sat in that control room, the Empire's forces closing in, they knew that whatever happened next, they'd face it together, with all the grit and gallows humor they could muster. "Here's to reckless plans and improbable victories," Ilara said, raising an imaginary glass to her lips. "To the underdogs," Nico added, joining in the impromptu toast. "And to sticking it to the Empire any chance we get," Jax finished, his grin wide and unyielding. As the sounds of the Empire's approach filled the air, they braced themselves for the next chapter in their saga of survival. Whatever came, they'd face it head-on, with all the sarcasm, determination, and wry humor they could muster. Because in a universe that was as unforgiving as it was vast, sometimes all you could do was laugh in the face of the abyss and keep moving forward, one step at a time. The air in the control room felt like it could be sliced into blocks and sold as doom-scented air freshener. Ilara tapped her fingers on the terminal, her mind a whirlwind of strategies that were either genius or insane, but who could tell the difference in a universe where the coffee of the day was usually impending catastrophe? "All right, folks," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Time for the big show. Let's see if our little upload has those Empire bastards dancing a jig." Nico, lurking in the shadowy corner like someone who had recently discovered their life's purpose, involved avoiding laser fire, snorted. "Dancing, more like scrambling to plug the holes in their sinking ship. We're just about to find out if it's a yacht or a dinghy, or a yacht-shaped dinghy," Jax added, leaning over a console with the casual bravado of a man who'd once used a live grenade as a paperweight. "Either way, they're gonna be pissed." Ilara grinned, the kind of grin that would make a lesser person check their life insurance policy. "Pissed is good. Means we're doing something right." The screens in front of them showed a galaxy-wide broadcast of the Empire's dirty dealings, like a soap opera, but with more war crimes. It was messy, scandalous, and exactly what they needed. "Hope they're enjoying their 15 minutes of infamy," said Nico, his eyes glued to the screens as if they were airing the finale of a particularly riveting series. "Do you think they'll go for whether it was just a prank defense, or the classic aliens made us do it?" "Bet on incompetence," Jax replied, grinning. "It's the only sure thing." A sudden boom rattled the control room, the walls shaking like they were in a poorly maintained washing machine. "Sounds like the Empire's here for their close-up," Ilara commented dryly, as if discussing the weather. "Great," said Nico, his eyes flicking to the ceiling as if expecting it to cave in any moment. "Maybe they've brought us a nice fruit basket, or a death squad." "Probably the latter," Ilara replied, already flipping switches and pressing buttons like a pianist at a particularly intense recital. "Let's give them a welcome they'll never forget." The room hummed with the energy of their defiance, outdated tech and all. It was a David and Goliath kind of situation, if David had a penchant for sarcasm, and Goliath was backed by a tyrannical empire. Outside, the sound of boots hitting the ground echoed through the corridors, a grim funeral march through the wreckage of their past lives. The Empire was closing in, and they were running out of time. "Look alive, people," Ilara called, her fingers dancing over the keys with a confidence born from equal parts desperation and adrenaline. "Let's see if we can't rattle their cages a bit more." They had one chance to turn this fiasco into something resembling a victory, and Ilara intended to make it count. She accessed the Enclave's defunct security system, praying to any deity that might be listening that it would hold together long enough to give them an edge. Nico, taking up his position near the door, whispered under his breath, "Here's hoping they didn't hire anyone competent this time." The feed on the screens flickered as Ilara patched into the security cameras, giving them a bird's-eye view of the Empire's advance. A line of soldiers marching through dreary corridors, as if they were rehearsing for a dystopian parade. "Well, if it isn't the cavalry," Jax remarked, peering at the screens. "Too bad for them, they're about to ride straight into the mud." Ilara set her plan in motion, using the Enclave systems to trigger a series of explosions throughout the facility, a chaotic symphony of fire and shrapnel that would hopefully buy them the precious minutes they needed. The first explosion rocked the Enclave, a deep rumble that spoke of collapsing walls and scattered ambitions. On the cameras, soldiers fell back, chaos erupting in their ranks like a well-planted landmine. "That should slow them down," Ilara said, satisfaction curling her lips into a smirk. "Let's see how they like a dose of their own medicine." But the Empire wasn't just going to roll over and die. Like any good villain, they were persistent. As smoke billowed through the corridors, she knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and came charging. "Any ideas for Act 2? Nico asked, his usual air of sarcasm tinged with an edge of urgency. Ilara glanced at the screens, mind racing. "We need to get this place locked down." She pointed to a section of the Enclave's blueprints on the terminal. "If we can funnel them into these choke points, we might just hold them off long enough. Jax cracked his knuckles, the sound like gunshots in the tense silence. "I'll take the first point. They won't know what hit him." Nico nodded, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. "And I'll make sure the second is ready to blow when the time comes." Ilara couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at their camaraderie, their willingness to stand and fight, even when every instinct screamed to run. "All right, let's show these Empire bastards what happens when you back a cornered dog against the wall." With a nod of agreement, they split up, each one heading to their respective positions with the kind of determination that came with a death wish or a hero complex. Either way, they were in it now. Ilara remained in the control room, fingers flying over the controls as she monitored their efforts. She could feel the pressure mounting, a ticking time bomb of nerves and adrenaline. The next few minutes were a blur of activity and explosions, each one a testament to their refusal to go quietly into the night. The Empire pushed forward, but every step was met with resistance, explosions tearing through their ranks like a well-executed plan. As the dust settled, the Empire regrouped, their numbers dwindling but resolve unbroken. Ilara knew it was a matter of time before they broke through, and she readied herself for the next stage of their improvised plan. "We're running out of tricks," Nico's voice crackled over the comms, his breathing heavy from exertion. "Ideas. Time to take out the big guns," Ilara replied, her fingers dancing over the terminal. "I'm rerouting power to the Enclave's defense systems. If they get too close, we fry them where they stand." As she activated the defense grid, a series of dormant turrets and energy barriers flared to life, casting the corridors in a hellish glow. It was a last-ditch effort, but one that might just give them the edge they needed. "Here goes nothing," she muttered, watching as the Empire soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed against a suddenly fortified position. Jax's voice came through the comms, laced with that familiar bravado. "They're pulling back." Looks like they didn't sign up for a barbecue. But just as victory seemed within reach, a new figure emerged on the screen, a man whose face was familiar in the way of old scars and bad memories. The Empire's representative, a sneer of confidence etched into his features. "Attention, insurgents," his voice boomed over the intercom, dripping with condescension. "Your little rebellion ends here." Ilara cursed under her breath. They'd poked the hornet's nest, and now the hornet was wearing a tailored suit and had an army at his back. "Guess it's time to face the music." As the Empire regrouped for one final push, Ilara's mind raced with possibilities. There had to be a way to turn this around, to hit them where it hurt most. "How about a change of tactics?" she suggested, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "If we can isolate their commander, we might just turn this into a negotiation." Nico responded, his tone skeptical but intrigued. "And how do you propose we do that? Walk up and ask for a friendly chat?" "Something like that," Ilara replied, a plan forming in her mind. "It's time to bring down the curtain on this little drama." She began rerouting the Enclave's comms, using the old, barely functional systems to send a message straight to the enemy commander. A bold move, but one that might just work. "This is Ilara Nix," she said, her voice broadcast over the Empire's own frequencies. "I propose a ceasefire. Let's settle this like civilized people." The comms crackled with static before the commander's voice replied, dripping with disdain. "And why would I agree to that?" "Because," Ilara said, a dangerous smile playing on her lips, "I have access to enough explosives to turn this place into a crater. You might take us down, but not before we make sure you're in the blast zone." The threat hung in the air, a promise of mutual destruction that left little room for argument. In the silence that followed, Ilara could almost hear the gears turning in the commander's mind. Finally, he responded, his voice grudgingly respectful. "All right, Nix, you have my attention. What do you want?" Ilara's smile widened, victory lingering on the edges of her words. "Let's talk about peace and how you're going to help us achieve it." In the end, it was a tense negotiation, one that involved more threats and bluffs than a poker game in a Shark Tank. But when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, they'd managed to reach a tentative agreement, a fragile peace built on shaky foundations. The Empire's forces retreated, their tails tucked firmly between their legs, and the Enclave held its breath, waiting to see if the peace would stick or crumble like a house of cards. Back in the control room, Ilara sighed, the weight of the past Iors crashing down on her shoulders. They'd done it, defied the odds, faced down an empire, and lived to tell the tale. Jax, grinning like a cat who just swallowed a particularly troublesome canary, clapped her on the shoulder. Not bad for day's work. Nico joined them, a weary smile on his face. Let's not make a habit of it, though. My heart can't take the excitement. Agreed, Ilara said, her voice filled with equal parts relief and exhaustion. Let's just hope the Empire learned their lesson. As they watched the remnants of the Empire's forces disappear into the void, there was a sense of accomplishment, a small victory in the grand scheme, but a victory nonetheless. In the end, they'd proven that even in the darkest corners of the universe, there was still room for hope, defiance, and a damn good laugh in the face of adversity. And as they settled in for a much-needed rest, they couldn't help but wonder what the universe had in store for them next. But whatever it was, they'd face it together, with all the grit and gallows humor they could muster. Because if there was one thing they'd learned, it was that sometimes the best way to fight was to laugh in the face of the abyss and keep moving forward, one irreverent step at a time. The Enclave, battered and bruised, stood under a sky that hadn't seen a sunrise in weeks. The Empire's ships, which had once hung over them like a guillotine, were now reduced to a retreating memory, a tale of twinkling lights disappearing into the void. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a pause, and sometimes that's all you need to catch your breath. Nico leaned against a bulkhead, the cool metal a balm against his sweat-sticky back. For once, the air didn't feel like inhaling pure anxiety. He took a deep breath, savoring the taste of something that wasn't fear. Remind me to send a thank you card to our Imperial friends. Hallmark doesn't do sorry for the attempted annihilation cards, do they? Ilara, exhausted but still with that grin that could cut glass, sidled up beside him. If they did, I'd buy in bulk. You think they'd throw in a box of chocolates, only if they are as bitter as their diplomacy, Nico quipped, the corners of his mouth twitching into a smile. Jax, who'd taken a moment to sit on a nearby crate, was scanning the remaining holofeeds from the Enclave's perimeter. Look at them run, he said with a chuckle, like rats leaving a sinking ship. Except this ship didn't sink, Ilara pointed out. We might be a little waterlogged, but we're still afloat, floating by the skin of our teeth. Nico's voice was dry, like he'd spent a little too much time in the sun. And speaking of teeth, my dentist is going to be pissed. All this stress grinding can't be good. Ilara shot him a sideways glance, her features softening. You're the one who volunteered for the Keep Calm and Carry On committee. Oh, I've been carrying on all right, he replied. Mostly because stopping might involve screaming. Ilara chuckled, shaking her head. I'd pay to see that. Their banter was an old, familiar song, a reminder of how they'd survived so far. It was comforting, in the way that only gallows humor could be when you were staring down the barrel of an uncertain future. Jack stood, stretching his arms high above his head, the cramped muscles protesting with a symphony of cracks. We should get moving. The Empire might have retreated, but they're not gone for good. We've got some rebuilding to do. Ilara nodded, the seriousness of their situation crashing back over her like a cold wave. First order of business, make sure our defenses are ready if they decide to come back. Second, see if we can't turn this pause into something longer. Should I get started on a great big welcome banner? Nico asked, the sarcasm dripping from his voice like honey. Maybe a buffet. Nothing says let's not kill each other like finger sandwiches. Save the sandwiches for later. Ilara's tone was brisk, but there was a twinkle in her eye. We've got work to do, and I need you sharp, not hampered by indigestion. The humans moved through the Enclave's silent corridors, Nico and Jax flanking Ilara like loyal sentries. Soldiers drifted past them, some with fresh bandages, others with fresh scars, all wearing the haunted look of people who'd seen too much but had come out the other side, for better or worse. They made their way to the command center, where the air was still thick with the scent of burnt circuitry and heated debates. Ilara settled into her seat, hands dancing over the terminal with a practiced ease that belied the chaos of earlier events. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she murmured, pulling up a series of reports on the Enclave's systems, the screens flickering with data like a caffeine-fueled ticker tape. Nico circled the holographic display, eyeing the damage reports. "I'd say we're looking at a solid 3 on the oh shit scale. Maybe a 4 if you're feeling pessimistic. Well, aren't you a ray of sunshine?" Ilara's voice was teasing, but there was a note of seriousness beneath it. "But you're not wrong. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Jax, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "What about the Empire? They might have backed off, but they're not going to play nice forever." Ilara leaned back, considering. "That's why we need to make sure we've got something to bargain with. If we can get them talking, really talking, maybe we can turn this into more than just a temporary ceasefire. Talking." Nico's skepticism was almost tangible. "I'm going to assume you're not planning to charm them with your sparkling personality." The grin that spread across Ilara's face was as sharp as ever. "Oh, you know me. I'm all about the charm." Jack snorted, his smile wry. "Let's hope they have a sense of humor, or at least a sense of self-preservation," Ilara added. "We've got some intel, remember. Something they're going to want, and we can use that. What do you propose?" Nico asked, leaning against the console with a casual air that belied his interest. "Leverage," Ilara said simply. "We've got proof of the Empire's dirty dealings. If they want to save face, they'll have to play ball." "Blackmail," Nico translated, the word leaving his lips with a hint of satisfaction. "Now you're speaking my language." Jax clapped his hands together, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "All right, let's get to work. I'll handle the defenses, make sure we're ready if they change their minds. I'll get started on the comms," Ilara added. "See if we can't open a dialogue." "And Nico, morale patrol?" he asked, the words carrying their usual sarcastic bite. "Morale patrol," Ilara confirmed. "You're good at keeping people from losing their heads, and here I thought my talents were wasted." Nico pushed himself off the console, straightening. "All right then. Let's get to it." They dispersed, each with their own tasks, the weight of their survival resting on their shoulders like the universe's worst backpack. As they went about their work, the Enclave slowly came back to life, a place that had been teetering on the brink of destruction now filled with the sounds of determination and quiet resolve. Hours passed in a blur of activity, the Enclave's inhabitants working with a dogged persistence that only came from living under constant threat. Repairs were made, systems patched, and defenses readied. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Nico found himself drifting through the corridors, checking in with the various teams scattered throughout the Enclave. He offered words of encouragement, sometimes snarky, sometimes sincere, as he made his rounds. "Hey, keep it up," he told one group, watching as they wrestled with a tangled mass of cables. "I don't know what that is, but I have faith you'll figure it out before it turns into a snake pit." They laughed, a genuine sound that was music to his ears. In another part of the Enclave, he found himself in conversation with a mechanic knee-deep in the guts of a transport vehicle. "Think you can get this thing running again?" he asked, eyeing the vehicle with skepticism. The mechanic shrugged, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "It's held together with duct tape and dreams, but it's not dead yet. Sounds like half the people I know," Nico replied with a grin. "Keep up the good work." And so it went, the day slipping by in a haze of repairs, preparations, and the occasional dry joke. It was hard work, exhausting in a way that made Nico's bones ache, but it was important. Eventually, he found himself back in the command center where Ilara was still glued to the terminal, her focus unwavering. Jax had returned as well, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of uncertainty. "How's it looking?" Nico asked, dropping into a chair with a groan of relief. He might have been young, but the day had been long enough to make him feel ancient. "We've made contact," Ilara replied, her eyes still on the screen. "The Empire's open to talking, but they're playing it cool. Want to make sure we're serious, serious as a heart attack," Jax muttered, crossing his arms over his chest. "What do they want? A meeting. Neutral ground. They're not willing to come here, and I can't say I blame them." Nico raised an eyebrow. "And how are we supposed to trust them not to double-cross us?" "We don't," Ilara said bluntly. "But we don't have much choice either. It's a risk, sure, but one we have to take." "Great," Nico sighed. "I love playing Russian roulette with our lives." Ilara reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've made it this far. We can handle whatever comes next." Nico's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "And here I thought you were supposed to be the optimist." "I'm a realist," Ilara corrected with a smirk. "I just happen to be right most of the time." Jax chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling. "As long as you keep being right, I'll keep following you." The three of them lapsed into a comfortable silence, the weight of their responsibilities pressing down on them like a familiar, albeit unwelcome, guest. They were far from out of the woods, but they weren't alone in this. That was something. Finally, Ilara spoke, her tone thoughtful. "You know, we've got a chance here to change things. Not just for us, but for everyone." "Big dreams," Nico commented wryly. "I'm serious," Ilara insisted. "If we can prove to the Empire that we're not just a bunch of renegades, maybe we can finally start moving toward something better." "Call me a pessimist, but I'm not holding my breath," Nico replied. "Still, if anyone can pull off a miracle, it's you. Thanks for the vote of confidence." Ilara's voice was warm, and for a moment the tension in the room eased. "So what's the plan?" Jax asked, always the one to steer the conversation back to practical matters. Ilara's gaze turned steely, her determination as unyielding as the hull of their battered enclave. "We go to this meeting, find out what they're willing to offer, and then we make sure we walk away with something we can use." "Sounds like a plan," Nico said, feeling the familiar stir of hope in his chest. "Small, fragile, but real." "Then let's get ready," Ilara declared, her voice carrying the weight of a leader. "We've got a new chapter to write." They nodded in agreement, the three of them standing as one. And as they set about preparing for this tentative step toward peace, there was a sense of possibility in the air, an understanding that, against all odds, they had survived. Now, perhaps, they could begin to live. The universe was vast, unyielding, and full of challenges they had yet to face. But they were ready, and more importantly, they were together. That was enough. And with that, they turned to the future, ready to face whatever came next with the strength of a people who refused to fade away quietly. Because this was humanity, messy, stubborn, and unbreakable.